Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on connection interfaces and devices. Now, real quick, just to get things started here, let's just kind of do a quick overview of this one section of many motherboards that we looked at back in the motherboards lesson, and I said we would come back to. And this is where we're coming back to it. And that is basically, this is a real zoomed in picture of the back side of a motherboard. This is the part that would be facing out of the case that you install the motherboard into. And this has some of your basic input-output ports. So some of the examples we have here are something called PS2 ports, and I will tell you this is a little bit out of date in the sense that these ports do still exist, but most keyboards and mice, which is what would go into these ports, we'll revisit that in just a few minutes, most of them are now plugged in via USB. We don't use PS2 anymore. Next to that, we have this real big port, and a lot of people, that's probably the number one port that people will ask me, what's that? You know, it's this big honking connector. What goes in there? That's something called the parallel port. Okay, that's a 25-pin port. We will come back and revisit that as well. I will tell you just kind of quickly, typically that's where your printer in the old days would plug in. Then we have this 9-pin port, and this is what's known as a serial port. And there were a number of different things that we would plug into a serial port. And by the way, you know, speaking of pins, if you look at the parallel port and you look at the serial port, you should notice there's a little bit of a difference. The parallel port is just a grouping of holes, basically. It's got 25 holes. Whereas the serial port, you'll see it's 9 actual pins sticking out. And that's a big problem that a lot of people have is they'll hear that something is a male connector or a female connector or a male port and a female port, and they want to know what the difference is. Well, the parallel port would be an example of a female port, and the serial port would be the example of a male port. And I will tell you that if the parallel port is a female port, that means that the connector on the parallel cable, that connector would have to be a male connector with the pins sticking out so that it can go into the holes in the female parallel port. And then the flip side would be true about the serial port, where since it's a male port, the serial cable will then have a female connector. Okay, the males and females always have to go together. That's kind of where this male and female port came from, is which one has the pins. The males have the pins and the females have the holes. All right, enough of that. Moving along, these two ports on the right side down to the bottom are USB ports. Now that would be something that is a little bit more modern, something that's more common. Matter of fact, today's motherboards, you'll see fewer and fewer of the PS2 parallel and serial ports and more of the USB ports. And then this last one up above the USB ports is what a FireWire port looks like.